Hello, students. I wanted to welcome you to this presentation of Illuminated Letters in the Book of Kells. And what we're going to discuss is a time in history before books. Most of the stuff we see will be before the 1500s, around 1490 something. And it's important to know that back then, not everybody was stupid, but many people were ignorant. And by that, I mean no one knew how to read. The reason why they didn't know how to read is because there weren't any books. Well, that's not exactly true. There were some books, mostly because there were no printing presses. The only books that were around were handwritten. That's right. If you wanted a book, it had to be written entirely by hand. Now, I want you to think about the last book you read. What would it be like if you had to take a pencil or a pen and write the entire book by hand? Would you do a good job? Would it be neat around page 300? Probably not. You'd probably get pretty bored. So, with that in mind, let's begin this journey of what it would be like to handwrite a book. Now, here we see a typical illuminated letter manuscript. And if you look at it carefully, you can see it's extremely neat. You look at the language and you probably won't recognize it. That's because it's written in Latin. And what is going on here is that monks in the Catholic Church, who were probably the only people who were educated at the time, other than the royalty, were sitting around all day making books in many of the monasteries. So, like I was saying before, it becomes incredibly boring that you sort of sit around and try to write a book. And also, when you look at just page after page of handwritten pages, it just becomes boring to read. So what ended up happening over a period of hundreds of years is they started to develop a style. They started to paint the pages, and they started to make beautiful illustrations. And moreover, they used silver and gold. That's right, pure silver and pure gold in their inks and paints. And what happened was, when you opened one of these books, it would shimmer and sparkle because of the valuable metals that were infused in the inks and paints. And as you look at this page, you can see that it looks golden. If you look at that initial D, you can see that it's kind of shining. And this is why they call it illuminated. That means the lights come on. Illumination, the lights come on. And when you see it, it sparkles. And this causes people to want to read and to want to look at the illustrations and to want to know what the story is. So this is sort of the beginning idea of what illuminated letters are. Here you see another example of illuminated letters, and I'd just like you to see how beautifully done the illustrations are. These people were not trained artists per se. They were calligraphers. They were people who learned how to handwrite very carefully over long periods of time. So you can imagine that one man might sit in front of this page for months trying to make this beautiful illustration and the beautiful border around it and write the letters perfectly. Imagine what it would be like if you made this beautiful illustration and you misspelled a word. You couldn't just erase it, so it had to be perfect. And these people's lives, whether they were going to be fed that night depend on whether or not they did a good job. So this is another example. So let's look at the next page. Here we see a very old songbook, and this really illustrates, oh look, I used illustrate. This really shows us the use of, and the definition of illuminated letter probably most literally would be this big initial. So the first letter in the first word of the first paragraph of a page would be very decorative. And you can see this letter P has gold all around it, and the whole page literally sparkles with gold. It made the page very beautiful. And the thing is some of these works are 1,500 years old and they still sparkle. They're still beautiful. They have this quality to them that's hard to describe unless you actually see it in person. This actual page is a songbook. So people who were singing their religious songs would look at this book and know exactly when the music was going to make its sounds. So this is an old music book, an old song book, and it was important to the church to have this look beautiful too. It inspired people to be in tune with what they were trying to sing about. So let's stop for a second and figure out what ended all of this. What ended this sort of process of handwriting books and, you know, entire cities only having one book, which was usually, you know, some form of the Bible. And, you know, the whole town would flock to the church just to see the one book. It doesn't sound like much of a life at the time, but at the time it was very important to have that one book in your town. So here you see a printing press. This was invented by a man by the name of Gutenberg. And we're not going to get into the whole story of Gutenberg, but suffice it to say that Gutenberg made this thing where he, instead of having to handwrite a book, he could push that big lever down and make a page of a book in seconds. And he could make many, many, many pages, and therefore make many, many, many books that were all correct, that were all spelled correctly, and everything looked great. So in a short amount of time, Gutenberg changed the world. And literally, children, I mean he changed the world, because now everybody could have books. Think about your house. Do you have at least some books in your house? This is because Gutenberg invented the printing press. And after he did that, that whole idea of handwriting books sort of went away. Who wanted to do all that work, right? So the next picture I want you to look at has to go back in time again to one place in Ireland, a place called, strangely enough, Kells. And at this place, one particular book was handwritten by the monks over a period of about 100 years. Let's look at that. Okay, so here is one page from a book called The Book of Kells. And it's a very elaborate initial. When you look at it carefully, you can see lots of knots, like people taking rope and tying knots with rope. It's remarkable because when everyone else was making these sort of hand-illustrated books with lots of gold and silver in them, they made very literal pictures of things. You know, if you were going to look at a flower, it was a flower. But here, they've just sort of done these knots, these kind of beautiful tied up knots in calligraphy, sort of as a picture of a letter. So let's look at another one so you can see more of what I'm talking about. Yes. So here's another one with lots of knotwork in it. If you look at the initial T, it's filled with gold, and yet if you look deep inside the letter, it almost looks like someone's taken yards and yards of string or rope and made lots of knots out of it. And this is the very way that the whole entire book of the Book of Kells looks. It's also important to note the kind of paper they used. Back then, they made a kind of paper called vellum, and this vellum was made out of calf skin. So I want you to think about the fact that although paper made from wood was around at that time, everybody knew that it wasn't going to last very long. So these guys thought, we should make this calf skin vellum. And because of that, these books from the 1490s are still around. You can go today to Ireland and look at this thing. And it's quite a sight, I'm told. So here you can see what a page from the Book of Kells looks like, just a normal page. And you can see the beginnings of many of these sentences have an illuminated initial. And then you can see sort of the super, super neat writing. When people talk about neat handwriting, children, this is it. Look at it. It is handwritten. I can't think that I would ever be able to write this neatly. I'd like to hope that I could, but man, look at that. So here's a last slide to look at. And if you look deep inside that letter T once again, you can see the knotwork that I'm talking about close up. Now there's some kind of a snake up there and lots of different other colors, and you can see the gold inlay from the gold ink and paint that's in the letter. But what I really want you to pay attention to is that very complicated looking knot. And I wonder, do you think that you could make a Celtic looking knot like that? I wonder if you could draw a knot that would be something like the knots in the Book of Kells.